By the summer of 1945, the island of Kyushu bore the scars of a nation unraveling. Entire towns had been reduced to smoldering shells, roads were littered with rubble and broken glass, and the sky above was a permanent shade of gray from the ash that lingered after bombing raids. In one corner of a ruined suburb near Nagasaki, what remained of a Catholic monastery stood like a skeleton of the past. Its chapel collapsed, its stained glass shattered, its stone walls scorched by fire. Beneath the rubble, in the shadow of what used to be a place of peace, hid the quietest casualties of the war, the children. There were nearly 30 of them, though no one knew the exact count. The youngest was barely walking, the oldest might have been 12. Most didn't know their own birthdays anymore. They had all been orphaned in a matter of weeks, some by bombings, others by disease, and some simply by abandonment when surviving parents went in search of food and never returned. They lived now in the monastery's cellar, sleeping on charred mats, curled beside one another like animals seeking warmth. There was no food, not anymore. What little they had scavenged from nearby homes had run out. At first they had eaten anything, bits of rice crust, burned vegetables, even roots pulled from shattered gardens. Now they chewed on sticks or fabric just to stop the gnawing inside their stomachs. Hunger was no longer a feeling, it was a permanent presence, as real as the cold stone beneath their feet. The air in the cellar was stale, heavy with mildew, ash, and the faint sweetness of rot. Rain had seeped through cracks in the walls, turning dirt into sticky mud. A few older children tried to keep the place clean, but their strength failed them more each day. Lice and sores spread unchecked. Every cough echoed with dread. No one spoke much. Words cost energy. Even tears had dried up weeks ago. At night, the children clung to one another and listened to the distant rumble of engines. Trucks, soldiers, boots crunching glass. The Americans, they were told, were devils. They would kill or capture any Japanese they found, especially children. That was the warning, passed down from teachers, from parents, from radio broadcasts blaring with static and fear. Surrender meant death. Or worse. So they waited. They didn't call out. They didn't run. They became still and silent as stone. Every passing day etched more hollowness into their faces. The oldest among them, a girl named Akiko, tried to keep a record in a torn notebook. But eventually she stopped writing. There was nothing left to record except who had died. Then, one morning, something shifted. A sound outside the ruined monastery, softer than tanks or planes. Boots again, but slower this time. The children froze. They had learned to do that. Movement was danger. Sound was risk. But what came next defied everything they had been taught. A figure appeared at the cellar entrance. A man in a dirty uniform, face unshaven, helmet hanging loosely. He did not shout. He did not raise a weapon. He simply crouched down and reached into a satchel. What he pulled out gleamed slightly in the morning light. A metal tin, opened with care, its scent wafting down into the dark. Corned beef. A second later, another soldier arrived, and then a third. Each had something in hand. A cracker, a canteen, a bar of chocolate wrapped in foil. The children did not move, but their eyes widened, not in fear, in disbelief. And then, slowly, one child crept forward, barefoot, silent, and reached out. The offering was accepted. No words were spoken. But the silence broke, not with a scream, with chewing, with swallowing, with a single sob that escaped someone's throat like a ghost finally exhaled. In that moment, the war was not over, but something else had begun. Not peace, not yet, but possibility. In the shadow of collapse, inside a monastery turned to ash, a soldier gave up his dinner, and a child lived another day. Sergeant Tom Handlin had been through nearly every stage of the Pacific War. He had fought through mud and madness in the jungles of Leh, watched his comrades fall in the chaos of Manila, and landed on Japanese soil with a weariness etched into every joint of his body. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of the monastery's cellar. It was not a battlefield. It was something much quieter and somehow far more devastating. The children didn't cry. They just stared, like ghosts still learning how to haunt the ruins around them. The decision to share his rations wasn't strategic. It wasn't part of a humanitarian mission or orders from command. It was instinct. He looked at a boy with a swollen stomach and bones like sticks and realized he couldn't eat while that child starved. From his pack, he removed a can of stew, his last. The day before, he'd thought about saving it for a long patrol. Now he opened it and placed it carefully on the ground, just within reach of the children. Others in the squad watched in silence. No one laughed. No one joked. They had seen Tom lead assaults under machine gun fire. They had seen him take shrapnel without flinching. Now they saw him crouched like a father at a dinner table, offering food to strangers who had once been the enemy. It broke something in them too. Or maybe it fixed something. One by one, the others began to follow. Private Ellis, barely 19 and still clutching the fear of his first real firefight, unwrapped a stick of gum and placed it gently in a girl's hand. Corporal Watkins pulled a can of beans from his kit, wiped the lid clean on his sleeve, and set it near a boy who hadn't moved since they arrived. Even Staff Sergeant Reynolds, who was known for refusing to share cigarettes, placed 2 hard candies on a rock and stepped back like he was performing a ritual. They gave what they had, not because they had extra, but because they didn't care anymore about having enough for themselves. Hunger had become familiar and manageable. Watching a child fight hunger, though, was unbearable. They skipped meals, lied on their forms about consumption, and tightened their belts at night just to stop the growling in their own stomachs. But they didn't stop giving. Over the following days, the squad transformed. What had once been a hardened fighting unit became something more fragile and more human. They started referring to their food not by military code, but by who it might help most. Give the peanut butter to the kid with the limp, someone might say. Or save the crackers for the little one who cried in her sleep. No one kept track of what they gave. There were no records, no reports. This was not an operation to be measured in pounds or calories. It was measured in eyes that brightened just a little, in fingers that stopped shaking when held. The Americans didn't know the children's names. The children didn't know the soldiers' ranks. But in that strange language of kindness and survival, they understood one another. Hamlin began rotating night watch duties not just for security, but so that one man could stay behind each day to sit with the children. He said it helped keep the nightmares out. The men didn't argue. In truth, most of them volunteered. They'd take a seat on the broken steps or a stone ledge and talk to no one in particular, tossing words into the quiet like breadcrumbs into a pond. Sometimes a child would come and sit nearby, not close enough to touch, but close enough to listen. Rations dwindled fast. By the end of the week, most men were down to half portions. Some were surviving on a single biscuit or spoon of powdered eggs per day. There were murmurs among neighboring units, questions about why Hamlin's men were falling behind in drills or looked so gaunt. But no one reported them. Rumors spread instead about what they were doing. And slowly, donations began to appear. A corporal from a different squad passed off a box of raisins without a word. A Navy cook snuck out a tin of peaches and left it on a supply crate marked miscellaneous. A chaplain sent down a bag of wrapped toffees with no note. These quiet offerings were their own kind of prayer, One man's sugar was another child's salvation. Despite their own hunger, no soldier complained. Not once. They joked about it, of course, called themselves the Walking Skeletons or Team Empty Stomach. But underneath the sarcasm was pride. The kind that comes not from medals, but from knowing that every night someone else might sleep with a full belly because you didn't. For Sergeant Hanlon, this became the only kind of war worth fighting. Not against soldiers or nations, but against the indifference that had left these children to rot. He had carried a rifle for years. Now he carried soup cans, blankets, and sometimes a silent child in his arms. And in that strange stillness between hunger and grace, he found something that no battlefield had ever given him: peace. Word of the children in the monastery began to spread beyond Sergeant Hanlon's squad. It wasn't official and it wasn't written down, but whispers traveled between camps and patrol units. Men passing one another on muddy roads exchanged nods and vague phrases. The kids, the old church, Hanlon's orphans. In a war full of secrets and orders, this was something different. This was sacred. It was the kind of truth that didn't need approval to be acted upon. Each day, more soldiers arrived, not with guns raised or tactical intent, but with open hands and full pockets. Some came on foot during rest periods, others diverted trucks under the pretense of maintenance or deliveries. They carried whatever they could: dented cans, torn blankets, broken toys, and scraps of soap wrapped in cloth. Many had nothing extra, so they gave what was theirs. A man would pull a tin from his personal reserve and say, "I wasn't hungry anyway," even though he hadn't eaten in 2 days. Discipline didn't collapse. It simply softened. Officers noticed missing items from storage or reduced ration reports, but no one filed complaints. A few quietly asked questions, and when they heard the answers, they nodded and looked away. This wasn't dereliction of duty. This was a different kind of service. Soldiers who had once measured success in confirmed kills now counted meals given, shoes tied, wounds cleaned. They became caretakers, not fighters. In the ruins of the monastery, routines began to form. Children were assigned spots to sleep, older ones helped sweep the floors with palm branches, and meal times, such as they were, became organized into turns. A medic named Phillips took it upon himself to create a crude infirmary using crates and a faded stretcher. He cleaned cuts with boiled water and crushed aspirin into powder to lower fevers. No one asked him to do it. He simply saw the need and stayed. One soldier, Private Dorsey, who had once been a high school music teacher, found an old harmonica among rubble. He began to play for the children at dusk, sitting on the chapel steps where the roof had collapsed. At first, the kids only listened from a distance, huddled like shadows behind columns and broken pews. But slowly, they drew closer. One girl, Emmy, started to hum. A boy clapped off rhythm. The music was simple, flawed, and beautiful. It was the first sound of life the monastery had heard in months. Soldiers began leaving personal items behind. A watch with a cracked face, a pack of cards, a comb. These weren't just gifts. They were fragments of a world beyond survival. For the children, they became treasures, symbols of safety, of people who stayed. One boy tied an American dog tag to his wrist with twine, believing it to be a kind of charm. Another wore a soldier's cap that dragged over his ears but made him smile with pride. But even in this fragile peace, the cost was real. Soldiers lost weight. Some developed infections from lack of nutrition. A few collapsed from heat and fatigue while carrying children to safer parts of the ruins during sudden rains. Medics patched them up and scolded them, but the men always returned. They would say, "The kids need me," and limp back into the monastery like wounded saints with dirty boots. Still, there was no glory in it, no fanfare. These weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were men who had seen too much destruction and found, in this place, a chance to do the opposite. They didn't talk much about what they were doing. They didn't pose for photos or write it in letters home. It was too delicate, too intimate, like breaking something holy if named aloud. A few higher-ups grew nervous. Whispers of court-martial or reassignment hung in the air. Regulations were regulations, after all. But then an officer visited the monastery unannounced and saw a child asleep in the lap of a corporal who hadn't eaten in 3 days. The officer said nothing. He left a crate of powdered milk at the entrance the next morning. By then, the men didn't feel like an army anymore. Not the kind trained to kill. They felt like protectors of something rare and flickering. They walked differently, slower, more aware. They spoke gently, even among themselves. And though their weapons remained slung across their backs, unused and heavy, it was the food in their hands and the warmth in their eyes that made them soldiers worth remembering. Over time, the ruins of the monastery began to change. What once felt like a place of decay started to resemble something like a home. It wasn't deliberate, no one had a blueprint, but small acts of care accumulated. Meals given regularly, corners swept clean, blankets folded in rows. Slowly, the chaos settled into rhythm. The stone walls no longer echoed only with silence and fear. Children, once too weak to move, now formed small clusters during the day. Some played with discarded tin cans, others drew in the dirt with sticks. Laughter, quiet at first, began to reappear like birds returning after a storm. The older kids helped the soldiers carry water or organize supplies. They weren't assigned these tasks, they simply wanted to help, to be part of something again. Inside the main hall, the soldiers created makeshift sleeping quarters. Doors scavenged from nearby buildings were laid across crates to make low beds. Tattered uniforms were turned into pillows, and parachute scraps served as curtains to shield the younger children from drafts. It was crude, but it worked. Every improvement felt like resistance against hunger, despair, and the memory of loss. The soldiers also began to learn names. Emi, Daichi, Yuto, Hana. Names that had once gone unspoken were now whispered with gentleness. With each name remembered, a part of each child returned. The soldiers tried to pronounce them correctly, even when their tongues stumbled. The children giggled at the attempts, correcting them with patience and pride. Mealtimes became the center of the day. A small fire pit outside served as a communal stove. Soldiers took turns heating cans, boiling rice, or mixing powdered milk. Children sat in circles, waiting with open hands and expectant eyes. Food was distributed carefully, never rushed, never uneven. It was an act of ritual, a reminder that everyone, no matter how small, mattered. One afternoon, a boy brought the soldiers a bundle of wildflowers he had picked near the stream. They were crushed and dirt-covered, but the gesture stunned the men. They placed the flowers in a chipped mug on the windowsill where the light still came through. It became a symbol, a reminder that even in war, beauty could survive, that a child could still offer something purely for the sake of kindness. The music continued each evening. Dorsey played his harmonica while the kids gathered close. Some tapped along with sticks, others swayed without realizing. A few of the soldiers hummed old songs under their breath, melodies from back home, now woven into the fabric of a distant land. The walls that once heard prayers and screams now held music again, soft and flawed and full of life. Letters from families arrived, redirected from base. Soldiers shared stories of the children with loved ones back home, omitting details that would never fit into government envelopes. One man received a reply with hand-sewn dolls and candies from his sister. He passed them out like medals, watching as the children cradled them like treasure. These tokens weren't just gifts, they were proof that the world hadn't entirely forgotten them. Rain came often, soaking the hills and dripping through cracks in the roof. But no one panicked anymore. Soldiers moved the children to dry corners, covered them with tarps, lit extra fires. There was a calm to it now, a practiced routine. They no longer responded to crisis with urgency. They responded with care. Every soldier carried their own grief. Losses from battles before this place. Brothers, friends, parts of themselves left behind on other islands. But in this ruined church, tending to children who had survived worse, something in them began to mend. They were not saints, they were not saviors, but they were present. And sometimes, presence was enough to build something that looked like peace. The monastery would never be what it was. Too many walls had fallen, too many lives had been taken. But among the broken stones, a new kind of sacred space had emerged, not one built by hands, but by will. A shelter not from bombs, but from forgetting. A fragile sanctuary held together by hunger, generosity, and the quiet determination to keep children alive one day longer. It happened on a morning thick with fog, the kind of morning where everything felt suspended, smoke, breath, even time. The children were still asleep, bundled together beneath shared blankets, and the soldiers were quietly boiling water for the day's thin broth. No one expected anything different. Hunger had become the day's rhythm. But then the sound came, a low rumble of tires on broken ground, cautious but steady, approaching from the eastern trail. At first, the men assumed it was another patrol truck or a redirected supply unit headed elsewhere, but the vehicle slowed as it neared the monastery's shattered gates. It was an old transport truck, dented and muddy, with tarps covering its back and a white cloth tied like a flag to the antenna. The soldier in the passenger seat stood up, waved awkwardly, and pointed toward the cargo. He didn't shout. He simply said, "It's for them." Inside the truck were crates, stacked high, marked with faded black stencils: milk, rations, medical, infant. It was more food than the soldiers had seen in weeks, more than the children had seen in months. Canned fruit, powdered eggs, flour, condensed milk, clean bandages, even a few bars of soap. Some of the soldiers stared, not out of disbelief, but because they couldn't trust that it was real. Wordless at first, the men began to unload. They passed the crates hand to hand, moving with a kind of reverence. Each box felt like a miracle. No one spoke of where it came from, and no one needed to. Somehow, someone had heard. Someone higher up had chosen not to look away. Whether it was command, a chaplain, or a string of letters from home, the supplies had arrived when they were needed most. The children gathered as the crates were opened. At first they kept their distance, unsure if it was truly for them. But then Emma stepped forward and was handed a tin of peaches. She turned it over in her hands as if it might vanish. When a soldier peeled back the lid and offered her the first bite, she flinched. Then she tasted it. Her lips trembled. She began to cry, not loudly, but in small, choking sobs that echoed through the courtyard. The rest followed. Carefully, the soldiers distributed food. No pushing, no chaos. Just rows of tiny hands reaching upward and larger hands gently placing food into them. Meals were portioned fairly, not just to feed, but to restore dignity. Even the youngest received something of their own, wrapped in cloth or tucked into tin bowls. For the first time, there was enough. The soldiers did not eat first. In fact, most didn't eat at all that morning. They watched, smiling, wiping their faces with sleeves, laughing softly when a child made a mess of jam or spilled milk in their lap. Hunger no longer mattered in the same way. It was the sound of chewing, the burst of laughter over a piece of gum, the wide-eyed awe at a banana that gave the soldiers their sustenance. That day, the monastery transformed again. With full bellies, the children moved more freely. Some ran for the first time in weeks. Others sang. A group of boys tried to build a cart from spare wheels and crates. Girls braided each other's hair using clean ribbons someone had tucked into the corner of a box. The fire pit became a gathering place, not just for warmth, but for conversation. By sunset, a calm had settled over the courtyard. The truck had gone, but its presence lingered in every opened can, every clean bandage, every satisfied breath. The soldiers took turns sitting watch, not out of fear, but to protect the feeling that had arrived with the food. It was fragile, like the children, like peace. None of them knew if more trucks would come. The next day might bring rain or silence, or orders that pulled them away. But for that one day, the monastery was something rare, a place without hunger, without fear, a place where war, for just a moment, was held at the edge of the gate and not allowed to enter. And in that moment, the soldiers were no longer just caretakers or warriors. They were witnesses to something sacred. They had given everything they had, and finally, something had come back. Not as reward, not as repayment, but as affirmation that what they had done, what they had given, had mattered. By the end of August 1945, the war was officially over. The formal words had been broadcast on radios and printed in newspapers, but at the monastery, the ending was quieter. There were no cheers, no waving flags, just a long, collective exhale. The guns had stopped. The bombing ceased. And yet, the silence felt just as heavy, just as uncertain. The children didn't fully understand what peace meant. For many of them, war was all they had ever known. The sound of boots no longer brought fear, but it still made them pause. Even as food became regular and soldiers smiled more easily, the smallest bang would send shoulders tensing, eyes darting. Healing was not instant. It came in hesitant steps, like a child learning to walk again after a long illness. Some soldiers were reassigned. Others were told to prepare for transport home. The men packed slowly, with more care than expected. They folded letters, repaired uniforms, wrote lists of names they didn't want to forget. A few asked if they could stay. On paper, it was for logistics, but everyone knew the real reason. They didn't want to leave the children. Not yet. Not until they were sure someone else would care for them as fiercely. Before departing, the soldiers made a promise to leave behind more than just supplies. They helped convert the monastery's main hall into a proper shelter. Cots replaced crates. A water tank was installed with help from engineers. Basic sanitation was introduced. A field medic agreed to stay another month. And a local woman, once terrified to speak to Americans, stepped forward to assist. Her name was Midori. She had lost her own children during the firebombing. The children adjusted. Slowly, they smiled more easily. They ate with less urgency. They reached out to be held without flinching. One afternoon, Daiichi, once silent and withdrawn, tugged on a soldier's sleeve and handed him a small wooden carving of a bird. It had taken weeks to make, and it had no words carved into it, but the meaning was clear. Thank you. I remember. When trucks came to take the remaining troops back to base, the departure was filled with tears. The children stood in a line, hands raised, waving with pieces of cloth. Some saluted. Others just stood still, their eyes following the dust trails until the trucks vanished over the hill. The soldiers didn't speak much on the ride back. One man wept quietly into his sleeve. Another clutched a small drawing a child had given him, a house with smoke from the chimney and people smiling inside. Back at the base, no medals were awarded for what they had done. There were no citations or ceremonies. But the men spoke of it often. More than battles, more than losses. They wrote about it in journals, in letters to wives and brothers. Some never spoke of it out loud, but carried it inside for the rest of their lives. A quiet pride. A secret chapter of war that made them feel human again. For the children, those weeks would become a dividing line in memory, before and after. The time when food returned, when people came not to hurt but to help, when Americans became not monsters but men with tired eyes and warm hands. The taste of canned peaches, the sound of a harmonica, the feeling of being lifted and carried to safety. Years later, some of the children would tell the story to their own families. They would describe the monastery, the ruins, the moment they tasted sugar again. They would remember names: Hanlon, Dorsey, Watkins. Not all survived to grow old, but those who did held on to those memories with reverence. They did not remember battles or dates. They remembered kindness. In time, the monastery was rebuilt. Part of it became a school. A plaque was placed near the chapel steps where children once gathered to sing. It read simply, "Here, in the ashes of war, strangers chose mercy." No flag was flown above it. No anthem played. But those who passed by often paused, and some, not knowing the full story, still felt the weight of it. Because in a war defined by destruction, what happened in those ruins was something else. It was not victory. It was not surrender. It was a handful of men giving their last meals to children who had nothing and asking for nothing in return. It was sacrifice in its quietest form. And it was proof that even in the darkest silence, humanity could still speak.